to unmute myself. It's time to unmute myself and welcome you to this month's Measure Master live training. I'm glad that you have decided to join me. If you can hear me, that would be great. If you could let me know in the chat that I'm actually hearable. And then we're going to get started in a second to go through this live training. So what is this all about? Measure Masters is our private community, our private membership for everything measurement. And you can check us out at measureschool.com/measuremasters. And we do live trainings just like this one every month, and then teach you something new around measurement. We sometimes have guests, sometimes I do the live trainings, and sometimes we have other Measure Masters also talking. So today we are going to talk about the Facebook Conversion API, and next month we are going to talk about server-side tracking. And there I actually invited our friend Simo Ahava to give a little talk. So if you're interested in that, head over to measureschool.com/measuremasters and sign up to our list. So and then maybe sign up to Measure Masters so you don't miss out on the next live training. So it seems like some people can see me and hear me and everything is good. Then I don't want to keep you waiting on this one as well. And what we're going to do today is talk about conversion, the Facebook Conversion API, more from an abstract standpoint. It's not going to be a tutorial on everything that you can do with it. It's also not going to be a step-by-step guide on how to implement everything with the Conversion API, because it is an API. It's an application programming interface. So you can do a lot with it. And I'm just here to give you the overview and show you the ropes and maybe some mistakes or some concerns that I also saw as well. So shall we get started? Let me see if everybody can hear me okay. We have some people here as well. Guido already joining us. Great to have you. Giacomo as well. And Anders is here as well. So yeah, let's get started and talk about the Conversion API. And again, if you have any questions, you can leave them in the chat and then we'll go through them later on and hopefully be able to answer your questions. Sounds good? Then let's get started here. Let me take a sip of water. A little bit of a presentation plan, a little bit of screencast as well. Hopefully my demos will work. That's always the big question. Okay. We'll talk about, first of all, welcome to this Measure Master live training for the month of July. Happy that you joined me today, and we are going to talk about the first Facebook Conversion API. This is a new way to send data into the Facebook ad system in order to track data with it in a broad space. Obviously, it's a lot about conversion tracking. It was also a lot on the end of making sure that conversions still can be tracked, or giving users a second way to track the check conversions after the iOS updates came out. We're going to talk about all of this today. And I'm going to give you my overview, a bit of opinion, and in the end, a Q&A. So if you're joining us live, put your questions into the chat. I won't be able to read the chat right now during the presentation, but I hope I will be able to answer your questions then afterwards. So a little bit of a presentation here. We need to start out right at the beginning. Facebook Conversion API. What is this actually all about? My clicker doesn't work. What is it? So what is the Conversion API of Facebook? So you might be familiar with the Facebook Pixel. That's something you install on your website, and it sends data to the Facebook ads system. The Facebook Pixel was the staple of tracking for a long time, especially if you do advertising on Facebook. You were able to do retargeting and then also conversion tracking with the Facebook Pixel, even a little bit of analytics, although they turned off the analytics product a while ago. Now, they gave us a new way to send data to Facebook. It's still sending data to Facebook, which is the Conversion API. And this CAPI, or Conversion API as it's called, will not be sending data from the user's browser and to Facebook ads, but a server. So that would mean that you are not installing something with JavaScript, for example, on the HTML of your website that gets downloaded by the user, and then the user's browser executes some JavaScript and it sends data to Facebook. Now you are actually, with the Facebook Conversion API, sending data from a physical machine that could be somewhere in the cloud, could be a machine at home, although most of the people don't have a server sitting at home. But it could be something that you rent from somebody, for example, a Shopify store. You just rent that software from Shopify, and they could send that data over to Facebook. So it's not executed on the user's browser anymore, but on another machine. So why is this actually important? Why did Facebook give us this capability? Well, it's because of tracking preventions that have come up in the past few months, on the last few years, driven by regulation, but also by changes in private companies' policies. So we have, for example, that browsers are changing and refusing to send these information to advertising trackers. So we have, for example, Safari with their ITP initiative, Intelligent Tracking Prevention initiative, to prevent certain trackers from getting data of the user on the browser. We have also browsers like Brave that are very privacy conscious, Firefox. And then on the other hand, we have Chrome, which also has started implementing some protections for the user's privacy. Then we have also on the OS level, now the first OS level, a restriction that came out with iOS 14.5 introducing, well, even before that already, the iOS versions, the new iOS versions now ask the user if they want to be tracked specifically by apps that are sending data over, and you can opt out of that, which also prevents data from reaching Facebook servers if you have Facebook conversion tracking, for example, through a Pixel install. And then we have the upcoming Cookie-Geddon. It's something that, because of all these privacy concerns, has been discussed a lot throughout the community of browser vendors. How can we maybe get rid of third-party cookies? How can we ensure that the information of the user is kept private, and do that in a manner so we still be able to track? This is a change that is not yet implemented, but by some browsers, there are more restrictive methods now in place. But with Chrome, one of the biggest browsers out there, it will come in the next year. I think they revised the timeline to 2023 when they want to phase out third-party cookies. Facebook itself is not really reliant on third-party cookies anymore. It's mainly a first-party tracking tool now. But again, this is all clamping down. Now, what can be done with the Conversion API? It means that, let me just see in the chat. It just means that now you are not sending data from the user's browser, but for example, if you have a Shopify store installed on your Shopify store, which is not running on your computer, it's running in the cloud. Once somebody does a certain action, for example, he buys a product, then Shopify can be sending that data over directly from their server, this blue thing here in the middle, to Facebook. And you can do different methods here, but in the end, you have now the ability, another connection point to the Facebook advertising system, to send that data in specifically via a server connection. And thus, well, working around the restrictions that you sometimes have in the browser space, client-side tracking, as it's also called. Now, it's important to understand, and this is a question that I got a lot of times, can I get around all of the tracking preventions that Apple has in place? No, you can't with server-side tracking. Even with server-side tracking, can I get around any kind of privacy pop-up, or don't I have to ask my users anymore for consent? That's also not true. Server-side tracking is simply another way to send data over. The restrictions, all the regulations still stand, and you need to be thinking about this ethically. How am I actually using the data of the user? So I wouldn't say that this is the magic pill that everybody wants to just install it and then everything will be fine. No, you still need to think about your data. You still need to think about how you're sending data in and what you do with that data, and then also how you're handling that data from a user privacy standpoint. So it's not a magic pill in that end to get around tracking preventions. Yeah, there are always ways to also block these requests as well. Okay, so how do we now use this? And this is probably the question and most people are asking for. How can we use the conversion API to send data from whatever entity that you have? You might have an app, you might have a website, you might have something else, a registry system, into Google, into Facebook's ads system. And yeah, let's go through a little example here. We are dealing here with an API, with an application programming interface. Now, you might know APIs as, or it's commonly explained as something how software can communicate with each other. So there might be an API here and be an API there, and they can talk to each other through a common method. And so an API is just another way to, in our case, send data into a system. We just need to know how we can, what language it speaks in order to send that over. Now, the Facebook Pixel was kind of also already an API. All we had to do is install this little bit of JavaScript and it just did everything automatically. Now, this API actually works a little bit different because it's not going through the user's browser. It, in some sense, it doesn't have anything to do with your website. It might only have something to do with a server that you need to set up and communicate correctly. But in the end, what you need to feed that API is simply an API request. Now, an API can be built in many different ways, and Facebook has obviously got a lot of engineers, and they have done a quite well job to write this API, but then also document it and give us the tool to actually try it out. Yeah, and that's what we are going to do right now. So let me switch over here and go to my events manager in Facebook. And so here I have a demo pixel account, and we're going to go to overview here, because here is where you can say, I want to send in, you have your pixel ID, obviously. I'm going to copy this right here. And then you'll be able to choose, let me see, manage integrations. So maybe I can even do this little trick here. Okay, so you can see manage integrations, and then you see your new options. You have the browser pixel that you can install, obviously, on your website. Then we have the conversion API. And if you go here to complete setup, it will open up a little bit of a guide for us that we can step through. So the first thing that we need to actually generate is an API token. And this API token is a key so that you can identify yourself that you want to send data to this Facebook ads account. If somebody would know this API, and theoretically you could copy it right now and could send data to my Facebook ads account, although it's just a demo kind right here. So with this key, you would be able to send data in. And the good thing here is that this key is something that's generated, so you can keep it private, so only you see this, and Facebook actually doesn't notice. It just authenticates you later on against this key. It's like a password. So you need to remember this password. So we're going to copy this as well. And then we're going to go ahead and look at this next part where we send events through the API. Now, in order to send data through the API, we're using HTTP protocol, and we need to send it to a URL. Just like if you open up a browser and you send a GET request actually to a browser saying, I want to get this website. This is what you are doing in essence with the Facebook API. Something special called a POST request, which you can put into your programming language in order to do the right request here. And then you need to have a request URL, just like in the browser. This time it's graph.facebook.com. You put the API version here, you put your pixel ID here, and then your access token. So it needs to be authenticated in that way. Then you have a list of different standard events, obviously, or hopefully you already know them, like page view, purchase, and so on. These are events that are also in the pixel. So these are standard events, add payment info, and so on. I'm not going to go through this right now. And we can, and it's pretty well documented how to do this, or what you actually would need and how you send that data in. You can send in event parameters. So for example, the revenue, the revenue, for example, or the currency. You can send in user data as well. So if you know about advanced matching, there's something like the email address. You need to send this in hashed, for example, to the Facebook API. And you can send in data like a client ID. So if you have a unique ID for the user because he's logged in, that might be something that you want to send over. And some custom parameters, which we'll get to. Now, Facebook gives you a little bit of help here with a payload helper. This is similar to what you might know if the pendant to the Facebook conversion API in Google Analytics is actually the measurement protocol. And you might be familiar with the hit builder. If you ever tried out, you can create a hit through a little bit of a form here and then send it over to Google Analytics. Now, Facebook has built something similar with the payload helper. And this is where you have a little bit of a form. So you could put some information in here. You could, for example, say, I'm not sending this from an email. I'm sending this from a website, for example. And it will change the code over here. So this will be the data that you would need to send over. This is in JSON format. So if you know JSON, all the better. This needs to be formatted correctly. And then once you have all the data available, you can go over to this Open Graph Explorer here. And this is kind of like an API playground that you can send data into the Facebook advertising system. Again, what you would need up here is the URL. So you're sending a post request to this version 11 API. You need a pixel ID. So we have copied this. Just going to open. This is my pixel ID. Then we have /events. That's important. And you need to put in your access token here. So I have my access token right here. We'll give you like a little bit of an error, but that's just because how this tool is built. And then here you can put in your JSON data. And you have, for example, like event name, your event time, your website, user data like the hashed email, custom data like currency, USD, and value, which you obviously need for a purchase conversion. Now, I know for a fact when I click here on submit, it will not work because something is wrong in the Facebook documentation. I have tried out over several hours how to get this right, and I finally did it. So I can just copy this in here. The only change that we are doing here is actually we are also putting the client IP address in here and the client user agent, which Facebook apparently needs in order for this to work. Now, last but not least, like inside of the Facebook pixel, you can test these events. So I'm going to go back to my event builder, my event manager. And we can click here on test events. And let me clear this. For our server events, we have something called a test event code that we can add to our request. So it actually will show us later on inside of this interface. So I've done this already. Be aware that this test code can change, so you might need to change it from time to time. So here we have test 20, and it's implemented in this request as well. And then we can hopefully not get an error. It sends it and says events received. And now inside of our events manager, we should have under the test events our purchase here with our data that we sent over. So theoretically, this is what your developer would do in order to play with this. We have now sent manually a request into the Facebook conversion API. Now, don't be afraid of what everything I've done here just now. This is just to show you that in the end, if you know about API requests, you would just send a post request over with this data and the test event code. And this is what your server would need to generate or need to send automatically if you would be implementing this manually on your site. So this is how it's done manually. Obviously, this is not something that is quite as sustainable if you are no, this is not working. Did my My thing crash. Let me just see what I've done here. Still seems to. Just seems like my screen is frozen somehow. So hopefully you would be able to follow me along. But what I'm going to do now is restart my streaming thing here. So 1 second. And let's see if we get back. Yes, okay. So we are back in the presentation. And we have just sent an API request via a manual method. You could also do this via your browser or other methods if you have a server available there. Okay. So how do you now do this practically on your website? How can you implement this for clients, for example? And I will get to this in a second, but first I wanted to go through some considerations that you should be taking into account and maybe also talking with your clients about or with whoever you want to implement this in. The first part, do you actually need it? It's kind of a hard case right now to say we need to implement conversion API. A lot of people think it's the big thing around server-side cookie getter, and we need to get ready and so on. From my perspective, there is definitely a case to be made. If you're a hardcore Facebook advertiser, then you might want to get all the data that you can into the advertising system and give Facebook as much data as possible. At the same time, the Facebook pixel still works, although in a diminished kind of capacity. So you have the Facebook pixel. It's far easier to implement. You have all of these ways and helpful guides and videos and so on out there that will guide you through it. Conversion API is very much more individual in a sense, and you would really need to put some time and effort into thinking through how to implement this. So that's why I want to give you just this question at the beginning. Do you actually need it? Think about it, and is it actually worth it? So another consideration here is, are you doing parallel tracking? So Facebook actually still recommends to have the Facebook pixel installed and then also sending data over via the Facebook conversion API. So double tracking, essentially. What you would need to do on the backend then, or when you deploy tracking, you would need to send something called the event ID with your hits. So Facebook would be able to deduplicate both of these hits and know which one to keep and which one to discard. Now, parallel tracking is a big consideration, because then you would also need to change around how you are doing your Facebook pixel tracking at the moment and change that around as well. And then we have consent. This is very important. A lot of people forget consent is just like a little thing that we would that we can now forget about because we are doing server-side tracking. No, consent is still very much a big thing inside of server-side tracking, inside of the conversion API, Facebook conversion API. You would need to adhere to consent. If you're in the European Union and you have this consent banner on your website, you would need to integrate this with your Facebook conversion API request. And that would mean that even though a lot of these softwares now say, hey, we will take care of like integration with this, once you start building out a Facebook conversion API implementation with server-side tracking, you would need to also know if the user has allowed this kind of tracking mechanism and then adhere to it. So send the hit, don't send the hit. Obviously, there are more capabilities now. You could say, hey, the user has not yet allowed it, but maybe he will allow it in a few page views down the line. Then we'll batch all the hits in one inside of our server implementation, for example. There could be feasibly something that is pretty cool, but definitely you would need to still integrate it with your consent management tool. So don't forget about consent. It's not something you can get around with conversion tracking. And in some instances, it might be even better to do server-side tracking, because now you can really strictly control on your side who gets which data with this consent method there as well. And then last but not least, I think you should think about the resources. I always find too many people who say, I want to implement conversion API, but they don't have a developer. They don't have the knowledge of the conversion API, but they just want everything to work. And that's just not, I think, feasible. In the end, depending on your implementation, it really depends on what you're dealing with. So if you have a WordPress website or Shopify store, it might be easier to do. But if you have a custom website that needs custom implementation, it might be harder to do. So look at your resources that you have available in the end. Do you have a developer that can implement this? Do you have somebody that can watch the data and see anomalies? Do you have somebody who can implement this correctly and guide maybe a developer through the implementation so you get the right data? Do you have third-party sources that you want to integrate into this? That might be something where you need to think and map it out correctly, because when you're going to server-side tracking, it's not as standard anymore as with the Facebook pixel, where you can find a tutorial online and say, okay, this is how you do it. No, server-side tracking is much more opaque. You will not be able to see with the Facebook pixel helper what is actually happening on this server request, much harder to debug. And yeah, the knowledge needs to be out there. So resources, resources, resources. If you have all the resources, go ahead. So here are 4 ways to implement the conversion API on your website. I kind of came up with 4. I guess there are more out there, but I think these are the broad categories. So the first one is definitely code. If you know how to code, and if you have a self-built website, that is probably your option that you want to go through. So for example, on our documentation of Facebook, they have code examples. So what you would find is, let me see. I didn't pull it up using the API. So once you want to go down the custom coded route, you definitely want to take a look at the requests here. So this is a curl request, which you could be sending with PHP or with Node.js. If you have a Node.js server, PHP here, Python, and so on. So it depends on the technology that's running on your server, and you would need to know, obviously, the technology very well and how you can pull out data from the database and pass it onto the conversion API, and then build a module or an integration or a plugin for this particular use case. You need to know coding for this, and you need to test this thoroughly. Facebook gives you the tools, and they are able to see what, or in this documentation, it's quite well documented. I would say I haven't quite gone through everything, so I can't vouch for it, but yeah, they are trying to help people who need to integrate this in a custom website. So really, I'd say that's like your chance to actually do it if you are in that realm of a custom implementation. What is the bad and the ugly? What is the good and the bad on this implementation when you're working with code? First of all, it's super customizable. You can feasibly get anything done that you might want. And if you have a good developer there, he might be able to have some special requests, and you can be really creative with what data you want to be sending into Facebook's conversion API. The bad thing about it is you need, obviously, the resources, you need the knowledge. For us marketers, it might not be very feasible to always go to the developer and say, hey, I want to send out now this data or that data. So a bit tricky on that end. And obviously, if you think of the resources, if you need to hire a developer, then it gets quite costly as well. Okay, the next method would be API glue. I call this glue because there are some startups out there or some software out there that glue certain APIs together. The most prominent one is Zapier. So you probably have some tools running, like for example, I have a calendar scheduling software that I'm running, or I'm subscribed to, or I have an email tool that I'm using. Now, all of these tools have nowadays integrations with Zapier. So what you could do with Zapier is to take to connect your tool of choice, the action that you want to track, and connect it to Zapier, and then tell Zapier, okay, once this action happens from this user, I want to send a Facebook conversion API event to Facebook, and Zapier could take this over for you. And this is pretty great because, well, yeah, we can just go into the pros and cons here. It's pretty great because you don't need to know any coding. You can do it through a visual interface. You can connect a lot of different tools to the Facebook conversion API, and you wouldn't need much input from a developer if you are adept enough to click yourself through Zapier. The bad thing about this is, the first thing, you need to understand the conversion API still. So what data do I need to send in order for this to make sense? So for example, if you want to get good conversion data, then you probably need, for example, the Facebook click ID that gets attached to the URL when somebody clicks on an ad, in order for the Facebook advertising system to recognize there's somebody from Zapier that sent me something. This is this user that clicked on this ad. Otherwise, you don't really have a connection there. Or you would need to have a lot of this hash data, for example, email address, phone number, and so on. So for Facebook to make sense of it. The bad part here as well is that I would say Zapier particularly, or Integromat for that matter, so they are not tracking tools. So they're not built for tracking. So if you have millions of hits coming through and millions of data points that you want to send to the conversion API, then it gets really, really expensive. So Zapier is more made for like automation stuff, like, oh, somebody tweeted at me, I want to get an email, or I want to put it into a spreadsheet or something like that. Zapier is not built for like event tracking in that sense. So what you would maybe looking at other tools out there, like an Automate.io, I think does this, or a segment.com that can take that data and deal with it more in a tracking manner than something that would be for automation. But Zapier is a good example. Now, if you want to see how to actually do this, I will not go through this right now. We did a video on the YouTube channel with Cedric, who showed how to send data, for example, from a Google form, right? A Google form, you cannot install a Facebook pixel on a Google form. Once you submit a Google form and you have all that information from the user, you can send a conversion API request to Facebook via Zapier, because you can connect Google Sheets or Google Forms for that matter to Zapier, and Zapier has a connection to the conversion API. So yeah, I would say that it's a good middle ground, but at the same time, I don't use Zapier personally for tracking anything. So it's more of a duct tape solution, I would say. Not a glue solution, but a duct tape solution in the end. Now then we come to plugins and native integration. This is the other spectrum of like coding. The other spectrum is probably having a plugin and native integration. So if you think of systems like WordPress or Shopify, these are basically toolboxes that help you to build an online store or a website or blog. And they are built systematically on the server. The software that is running is built in the same way. So what programmers can do is they can build plugins, or the development team, for example, of Shopify, they've built an integration directly to Facebook conversion API, because they know exactly what will happen when somebody buys a product, for example. And this happens on every store that is buying with Shopify. So there's no kind of big difference, or there's kind of a standard. That's why Shopify is so successful. They are pretty easy to set up. The stores kind of work, and you can't really customize much. So you can't do much wrong. That gives the advantage to the software developer of Shopify to say, hey, we are going to build a native integration to the Facebook conversion API. So let's check this out. Here on this Shopify store, you can, for example, install, if you haven't done this yet, you can go to preferences here, and you can click on installing your conversion pixel, and it will just ask you to install an app. So here, set up Facebook, you would need to click that button. then we'll install this app here. You need to identify with your Facebook account, so and choose the ad account and so on. And so you log in, and then you get this Facebook interface, which apparently doesn't load. And then you'll be able, in the settings, to go to the data sharing settings. And here is where Facebook integrates the Facebook Pixel, for example. And you have a level of data sharing here, where if you choose maximum, it will utilize the conversion API to send data information about the customer, but also about the users who have bought something, to the Facebook conversion API. And it will automatically deduplicate this as well. And you don't have to do anything else, right? It's a native integration built by Shopify. So they have tested it over millions of stores, and therefore, or thousands of stores. I don't know if they're probably millions of stores. And in the end, it works, right? At least on that level of what Shopify provides. Okay, and WordPress kind of has the same. Did I log in here somewhere? Yeah, here. So on the plugin directory of WordPress, you can install the Facebook plugin, the Facebook for WooCommerce, for example, plugin. And this is made by Facebook, and they also integrate with the conversion API. The only thing is that it has very low ratings. I don't know why, but hundreds of thousands of people have it installed. And yeah, it also connects to the Facebook conversion API. I haven't quite set this up yet. It's quite convoluted. Like you need to also connect to your Facebook account and so on. This is built by Facebook, so it should work. But when you look at WordPress can be highly customized, and therefore it doesn't always work. So I would test this out before you take this into production and say, my conversion API is not working. But as this is just an example here, you can also install a plugin into WordPress and then make this work as well. There are some other plugins that also do this. I haven't tested them out. I can't vouch for them. But definitely there are plugins out there that then connect to the Facebook conversion API, especially if you have a paid plugin as well. Okay, so what is the good, the bad, and the ugly on this one then? So the good thing is, obviously, it's easy to set up. If you are starting out with a store and don't want to pay anybody, it's very resource free, or resource, how do you call it? You don't need many resources. Then on the other hand, though, it's not very customizable. It's something that is built for the standard case. You also need to remember the standard case of a Shopify store. If you have any kind of plugin installed, like the Recharge app or something like that, then this might not work. You have a risk that something might break at any time, and then you don't know who to ask, because you might choose, like, you can't call Facebook and say, hey, your conversion API plugin doesn't work or so. And I would say that another negative is that, it might not even work at all on your store. So if you have a WooCommerce store and it's highly customized, then you might try this out and it just doesn't work. So then you need to go the custom coded route. So if you have a plugin, probably really good starting point. If there's no native integration or plugin out there, then maybe you need to think about the other solutions here. Okay. Great. Let's go on to the last one, where I'm also going to show a demo, and this is Google Tag Manager server-side tagging. Now, Google Tag Manager last year brought out the first version of GTM server-side, and this is basically a version of Google Tag Manager that runs on a machine on a browser in the cloud. You need to set that up, and you also need to pay for this. So in that sense, you are able to do server-side tracking or server-side tagging. It's more a tagging solution because it acts as an add-on or a a proxy to your server, to your requests that you would send over to Facebook Pixel, but now you're rerouting that and sending it to your server. And then on your server, you are sending this to the Facebook Conversion API. And this is this gets around some of the tracking prevention methods. So ITP, for example, it will not get around hard blocking of any tracking requests, for example. But it is a very elegant solution which kind of gives you more control over what you're doing. You can view and set it up correctly. On the other hand, it is requires even more knowledge than the Facebook API to actually make this work. And just as an example, I will go through an example and set this up with you right now. Just to keep in mind, you still need to send or set up some kind of client-side tracking in order to make that work. So the request needs to be sent to your proxy, and from the proxy, from the Google Tag Manager server-side instance, it's being sent over to to Facebook's Conversion API. This is something you would need to have the knowledge in order to set this up. Google Tag Manager server-side, really quickly before we get started on this one, I have already set up a server-side instance. You need to do this on, you can auto deploy it to the GCP cloud, the Google Cloud Platform. It's not GCP Cloud, it's GCP, so Google Cloud Platform. And you can do this very cost-effective to try it out, but if you put it into production, it's recommended to buy some servers from them. And there are at least 2 instances, is $70 a month. So there are costs involved in this one. The second part would be that I have already mapped my domain. So this is an advantage of server-side tracking. When I send data to my server, to my Google Tag Manager server-side tagging, I send it to my own domain. I don't send it to tagmanager.google.com anymore. And that's an advantage because this is not easily found out by ad blockers, for example. Oh, he's sending advertising data over to his own server. So that might not be blocked, or in the end, there are methods around this, but it's one of the advantages. So that's something I've already set up. So let's take a look at what this would look like. So first of all, on my website, right, our demo store that you all know, we already have something set up. So the first one is a Facebook pixel, and the second one is a Google Analytics 4 tag. Let me just see. Okay. And these are sending data to, well, right now they're already sending data to our pixel instance. But normally you would have your Facebook pixel set up and your Google Analytics conversion tracking already set up. Now, on the other hand, I have something called, I have something set up called server-side tagging, or server-side Google Tag Manager server-side. And the only difference that you see right here is that I have a tab called Clients. And this is a special concept within Google Tag Manager server-side. You are sending data to this server that is in the cloud, and from there it will pick up the requests which are claimed by something called clients, and then the client sends it on and does something to it, so you can use your tags, triggers, and variables in the end. So kind of similar, but there's a big difference with the clients here. Now, what I can do in my server-side instance, and you see this is red because we don't want to get confused with the client side here, is that I can go into this preview mode, and this will open up the server-side preview mode. It kind of looks the same, but we also have requests here and so on. Now, my URL that I use to send a request, just like we did in the API, is, well, it's AppSpot right here, but I actually mapped it to what you see here, track2.measure.school. So what I can do is I can just send a request, for example, with a test here in the end. It says it doesn't work, although it should resolve. Let's see if we have a request here. Yes, we have a request that is now came into server-side instance. So this is how you send data now, not to Google Tag Manager, not to Google Analytics, not to Facebook, but to my own instance of Google Tag Manager server-side. So the question becomes, how can I now send my data from my client-side implementation, which I have implemented on my website right here, to the Google Tag Manager server-side instance? We can do this simply by using the Google Analytics 4 tag. So instead of sending our data to Google Analytics, we can actually now, and this is a new option that was revealed a few weeks ago, I guess, send data to server container. You can tick that box and put in your own server container URL. So in my case, it would be http track2.measure.school. And what this will do then is it will take all that data that it anyways takes from Google Analytics 4, but send it to my instance here of my server container. Let's try this out. I'm going to preview, connecting to my demo shop. And once it loads, we should be seeing inside of our preview mode here that obviously on container loaded, we have our Google Analytics page view tag firing, and it's sending data to now our server-side instance. So in our server-side preview mode, we should see something, but we don't. I think it should be doing it automatically. Let me reload this. Hopefully my demo doesn't. Here we go. So we get a new request that came in, and the client GA4 claimed it because it's a GA4 request, and it then sent out. No, it didn't send anything out because no tags are firing on this one just yet. So as you can see here, let me just show you my face as well. As you can see here, we are now sending data just from Google, from our website to the server-side instance. It's not doing anything. It's not tracking anything. It's had nothing to do with Facebook just yet. But what we can do now is, since we are sending one request over, we can forward that data from Google Analytics 4 to our conversion API. So in order to do that, you would need to install a new template that is in the template gallery. I have already done this, which is the Facebook conversion API tag. So just go here to search gallery as the tag template, and you choose the Facebook conversion API. Once that's installed, you can go over to tags. And we can create a new tag. And in that tag, we can choose our Facebook conversion API tag. Now we get familiar data here. First of all, our pixel ID, which I have saved here. Then our API access token. Again, this should not be exposed to anybody, but since it's now being implemented in Google Tag Manager server side, nobody has actually access to that data and I cannot see it from the outside, which would be not the case when we put it into the client-side implementation. Okay, then we have a test event code. If we want to test our events, we can choose the action source and then a trigger. Now the trigger should be something that you create custom depending on which events you want to send over. You might not want to send over, for example, all of the custom events that you have in GA4. Now here you can say, for example, I only want to fire this on a event called page view, for example, so for example, page view, something like, no, the event name needs to actually be, let me think. The event name needs to be exactly what we have here. So page view, for example, yeah. Page view. You could also then refine this with a filter and say only when it comes actually from the client, where do we have it? The client name needs to be GA4. So it's only picking up GA4 requests. depending on how your implementation is built, you can even say, okay, well, this actually does it already. So for example, here we put in GA for requests or page view requests, for example. So this is a custom trigger now here, and we can give it a name. I'm just going to click save here. It will give me a name here. Okay. Let's save this and preview this whole thing. Okay, and now I'm going to go back to my site, reload that. You should send off a request. Yes, we get our request, and this time it sends off a tag to Facebook Conversion API. Now with this, we should now hopefully see a page view that came in to our system. So this is our page view that we have just sent over via our server-side instance. So this has now been relayed through Tag Manager server-side instance to the Facebook Conversion API. So we have integrated both of them on our website. Now, one thing that you see is that this is deduplicated. Is this already deduplicated? It should be duplicated actually, because let's see. No, it has been deduplicated, but I'm not sure why, because we didn't send the right. Or did we? Let me see. No, we didn't send any set to fields. None of these. Okay. Now, what normally would happen, and this, I don't know why it's already deduplicated, it would say that we are not sending the event ID because that would be duplicated. Why is this actually? Why do we have two page views here? Inside of our client-side implementation, we are still sending data via the Facebook Pixel, and this is something I set up earlier just to send data with our Facebook Pixel here to our, it's a standard event to via our Facebook Pixel, just like you probably know it from many other implementations. Now, this is sending data over, and then also our server-side instance is sending data over, and that obviously leads to a page view that is kind of duplicated. And then Facebook needs a way to deduplicate that data. And that's why you need to give a code that you send in both of these tags simultaneously into this system. So Facebook knows, these are from the same source. They are exactly the same event. And therefore, I need to deduplicate them. Kind of Facebook did this automatically already. But we want to still integrate the event ID. So you wouldn't need this if you're only sending data via the Conversion API and not sending a duplicated event via the Facebook Pixel. But Facebook actually recommends this parallel tracking in order to maximize the data advantage that they get through both of these data sources. So how would you now deduplicate them? You would create a variable that you can install on your website. I already have this here. But yeah, let's go over to new. And then you can go over and open this menu and add something to from the community gallery. You can just look for event ID. And there are some out there. So Markus Bersch, a friend of mine, he wrote event ID. And this is a little thing he wrote in order to make sure that this event ID is always the same, at least on the same event. And so what you would need to do is simply add this, and then you have this event ID in here, and then no configuration is required. You just need to install it. I have already done this. That's why I have it already here. And then you need to simply add it to your tags. Now, it's important that both of these events that you send over to the server-side instance and so on are on the same event. And then you can choose down here in the Facebook pixel template under more settings, the event ID. So the event ID is used for deduplication. You don't need this if you don't have a server-side implementation. So we have event ID, save this. And then also we have an event ID in our Google Analytics 4. Now here it's a little bit weird because we are working with Google Analytics 4, although we are not sending data to Google Analytics 4 at the moment. And here we can send in the event ID. I'm not sure if it's event ID. Probably it's event ID. And we are going to set our event ID and preview this. Page is loading. And now we should see inside of our preview mode, at least on our website, that okay, here's our right. I'm confused. Did they get rid of the variable menu here? No, I'm not on GTM, so I need to go to GTM here. Okay. So we have our Google Analytics 4 that fired and our Facebook pixel, and then under variables here, we should see that we have an event ID, and this is a unique ID. You don't need to care about it too much, but this deduplicates your events because we are sending it with this event here to our server-side instance, and we also are sending this event to Facebook pixel. And you would even see this on the site with the Facebook pixel helper, I think. So we have here page view, and here we have our event ID. So this event ID now also goes over to the server-side instance, and from the server-side instance, we now should have that also inside of our request variables. Let's see. We have event ID, and that's exactly the same event ID. And then hopefully in our test events now, we should have a new page view, which is deduplicated by the event ID. And here you see exactly the event ID directly. It may be that the last page view that we sent actually came in at the same time, and that's why it was deduplicated. But it actually had 3 seconds difference. But anyways, here you see that this data is now deduplicated because of the event ID. And Facebook will complain if you don't deduplicate and send both of these events in. Okay, this was it with my little implementation here. Are we stuck again? No, we are back. Okay. So this is it with the server-side tagging. The pros are definitely that you have more control and you can do a lot more with server-side tagging and Google Tag Manager, because you can feasibly send one request to the server-side implementation, and then from there you send a Google Analytics 4 request off, a Facebook conversion API request, a Google Ads request now, or any other implementation that you might have available. And so it consolidates the data streams, and you have it can bring improvements to your site speed as well. Lots of advantages of server-side tagging, but in terms of the Facebook API, this also integrates very well, and you can kind of still see and debug what is going on. You need to know how to operate such a server-side implementation. Theoretically, you also would need to know a little bit of coding in order to build your own templates if you have very special requests that go outside of the scope of the standard stuff that is out there, because there are not many templates yet out there that would be able to take over your request. It's getting more and more, and something is developing here, which is quite exciting. On the negative side, this actually costs money. It takes some resources to set this up. So somebody would need to know what they're doing in order to do this. It's not just a job from a perspective of like, oh, I'm going to do 2 clicks and then everything will be set up. No, you also need to know how to troubleshoot your data if it doesn't come in through correctly. But you have so much more capabilities in the end. Yeah, that's what I would say. One more advantage, you can take data streams that might not be accessible on the website itself, right? So Anders is here. I don't know if he's still here. There is, yeah, and Anders had last time in the office hours something about taking data from a CRM system, for example, and combining that with the Facebook data that came from the website, and then sending it over to Facebook. So you could do email hashing, send more data into Facebook, whatever they want. I saw that Matteo just entered as well. I think I have a recommendation at the end there as well. So if you want to learn more about this, I have a recommendation for Matteo's talk that he did at Measure Camp as well, because what I just showed is like a very basic implementation. There's also different ways to actually set this up and make it much more complicated than I have done here. But he shows 2 or 3 different implementations of how you could be working even with not Google Analytics 4 template, for example, or sending that over via other methods as well, but using Google Tag Manager server-side. So definitely check out that video as well. A quick summary here. I want to get to your questions. So the Facebook Conversion API is another way to send data into the Facebook ad system. You have you have different ways of actually sending data over, ranging from a native integration, which is 2 clicks and it sends data over automatically, to something more complicated or even custom, in this case, code. Or you could obviously use something like a proxy, like a server-side tagging implementation, like Google Tag Manager. And I showed you some examples how to go through this. The Facebook Conversion API is a welcome feature in the tool belt of a marketer to send more data into the system and hopefully lessen the blow of the whole implementation kind of, or the whole thing that's going on with tracking prevention, cookie getter, and so on. Okay, some resources. Yeah, I have linked it up here as well, Matteo. So the Facebook documentation is really good. Cedric did a video on Facebook API, Facebook Conversion API, and Zapier that you find on the YouTube channel. And the video that we can't watch right now, but it goes through 3 more ways to install GTM server-side Conversion API with this. So check that out as well. And then for that, let's go over to some questions. Whew, I talked a lot, but I'll try to make this as entertaining as possible. Who knows if I will actually be able to do this. Yeah, okay. I'm just going to put this thing here on and see what we have. So Guido is still here. Great to have you. How reliable is the event match quality report in Facebook's Event Manager? I don't know. I can't really speak to is this a reliable or not. It's just a tool that Facebook gives us. So anything that you have available for you to know, is this actually getting better or worse? It might be something that you want to use. The question is always like, what are you comparing it against, right? And Facebook is Facebook, so that's kind of the standard. So you can't really say, oh, and Google Analytics, it works this way, because Google Analytics is a completely different system. So if there are any errors there, I would definitely try to fix them. But to get a 100% score, you would need to send in a lot of data and make it as good as possible for it actually to work. So I hope that helps. But if anybody has so Matteo worked with it a lot. So maybe Matteo, if you put something into the chat, then everybody can benefit from that as well. So if I say anything wrong, please correct me there as well. We need to process of manual setup for Conversion API. Please explain us what is the method of Facebook direct setup for Conversion API. We know that you are the best. Thank you, Sadman. But yeah, I think I demonstrated it here, and I hope everybody understood what I was saying. In the end, you need to integrate it with your own programming language on your own server. Wow, the sun just came through this little hole there in my window. Let me shut the curtains. Okay, here we go. I'd encourage you to deploy through GTM server side using the GTM via transport functionality. That's by far the easiest way to do so. Yeah, the easiest way, I guess, is like a native integration. So Shopify did a job there. I don't know how good of a job they did there, but if you don't want to have any hassle, that's probably the easiest that you could go through. From experience, do you need to use client IP address and client user agent in order to have the Graph Explorer to work? The Graph Explorer, yes. This afternoon I couldn't get it to work. They even have a video underneath their implementation where they explain exactly what you need to click, and I did exactly that, just like in my videos, and it just didn't work. And then somebody in a forum said, put the IP address in and put the user agent in, and then it will work. And yeah, magically it kind of worked. But this is just the Graph Explorer API. So you would need to look into what requests you want to send over and which of these are actually necessary. For a event that comes from the website, so the action sources website, I read that you need to have the user agent and the IP address. So even that is something that Facebook, that Google Tag Manager server side takes over for you to forward that kind of request as well. So the IP address would be the server URL. How about third-party server-to-server trackers? Not sure what that would mean, because in the third-party context, you would look at cookies, right? Now, the cookies are something that you could grab and then forward to your server-side instance and then forward it onto the server as well. Yeah, maybe you are talking about like another server sending it to Facebook Conversion API. Yeah, you could definitely integrate that, and that would be possible. I guess a third party would be anything that is not under your specific control, or you don't host in that sense, right? So you are that's a third party system. Definitely, you could send it over to the server Conversion API. For a more consistent data stream environment, would you recommend instead using GTM due to maybe firing issues, directly use an API at the database code? Yeah, that would be then server-to-server tracking, or actually server-side tracking, right? Now, what we are doing with Google Tag Manager is actually server-side tagging. So Google Tag Manager is our proxy. We're first sending it over to Google Tag Manager server-side, and then from there over. And that could lead to problems. Now, anytime you have the ability to actually use server events directly, that could be a more reliable method, because you don't deal with anything what the user is blocking in his browser, for example. The problem with this is that a lot of these advertising systems still set cookies. They use cookies in a very extensive way. So if you are not sure what you're actually sending over, and you don't, I think the biggest part is the user identification. If you can't identify the user and sending a server request over, Facebook's Conversion API or Facebook doesn't necessarily know what to do with it, right? They wouldn't be able to connect it back to an actual advertising click. So you would see a conversion, yes, but you wouldn't see where this conversion came from, and Facebook wouldn't be able to say this ad actually resulted in this ad click, this purchase here. So in order to make this work, you would need to either find a workaround to grab those cookies and still do client-side tracking somehow, or you would need to store them in your database, or you have some kind of identification on your server side, so when somebody's logged in and so on, which can be more reliable, I would say. But yeah, always depends on the circumstances there. Sometimes you need to work with this as well. Cool. What is here? Don't you think it's getting more complicated every day with these new tracking systems? Yeah, it's definitely, I think, going more into the direction of customization, especially when you think of server-side tracking. This is not something that you would be able to just whip up and say, everybody, use this and click here, here, and here. So it's going away from the standard, and you need to implement it very much custom to your website, to your environment, to the tools that you're using. And unfortunately, also, it's not something that is getting more transparent. So Google Tag Manager and the whole browser checking is kind of easy if you compare it to 5-10 years ago, because we didn't have the tools necessarily to actually see what is going on. How is Google Analytics sending this data over? Nowadays, we have the Pixel Helper, for example, or the Tag Assistant, or we can look into server requests that are sent around. If you use server-side tracking and server information, then you might not be able to know what is actually going on right now. How is this data getting into my account? So let's say you connect Zapier to a Google form, right? You would get conversions without having a pixel installed on your website. So you wouldn't necessarily know where the data is coming from. You need to have a very good implementation, very good documentation, and the knowledge to actually manage all of this. So I would say it's getting more complicated, but yeah, change is the only constant in our industry. Cool. One more question here. Is the API useful? Can we use the CAPI via this? And can we set up the duplication via graph? Will you make a few? No, the Graph API Explorer is just that. It's an explorer. So Facebook has built this tool in order to be able to try it out and know which parameters can you use, which what if I change this around? Will my thing still work? So if we just go back here, and I go back to the Graph Explorer, right? And let's say I forget something. Yeah, for example, I take this one out, right? Let's take this one out. Okay, it gives me the green check mark, so I know my code is at least formatted correctly, but then I can submit it and I can see, okay, there's an invalid parameter. So this might be something, I guess you can't really see it. Let me see. So I have just deleted something from the request, and now I'm getting this error, and we can't really see the parameter. We can see that there's an error message that come out, and it's a missing currency for the purchase event, right? So we have done something wrong in the purchase event. So we can try out and explore the API with this one and send individual requests. But in the end, what you would do in terms of usefulness and making it actually useful to your business is to implement this into a server, into your software, into WordPress, into Shopify, and so on. So the Graph Explorer is simply a tool to explore the API, and it's very useful for developers to play around and see the error messages. So something that works here, you would create something here before you actually then start implementing it into your kind of server environment, into your Facebook pixel template, or your template that you build in the server-side environment, or into your custom app or your WordPress or Shopify and so on. So it is kind of useful, but it's not useful for somebody who wants to then track stuff directly. So I wouldn't use this because we would need to do this for every user individually. So just to try it out and see if this actually works. Okay. I don't know why it doesn't scroll further. Yeah, Matteo, you're right. We are in the GDPR cookie get on 14 consent mode server-side tracking era now. Yeah, and this is kind of like what you think the future is going to look like, growing concerns of privacy across. So privacy will be a big topic. It is already a big topic. It will remain a big topic, and it will get the thing that is just concerning our industry is at that point where we are kind of reliant on getting all that good data and so on. And we are reliant a little bit on the tool vendors now to do something. So Google Analytics is bringing out new tool. Google is bringing out new tools. Facebook is bringing out new tools. We are reliant on the platform that we're working with, which is mainly the browser or the internet. We are reliant on other platforms like Android and iOS. And it's a bit scary because we don't have direct control. I guess always as a marketer, you want to have results that you can replicate, right? So if you lose conversions or don't know how it's attributed anymore, and there's also a growing thing, a growing trend is machine learning, right? So this whole Facebook thing is also partly dependent on like how good is the machine learning of this algorithm of Facebook with aggregated events that we have and so on. So some people might say, oh, the machine will figure it out, and it's kind of that way, but then you don't really have control. You don't really know where the data is coming from in the end. It's kind of complicated, and this is where it's going to go. This whole server-side thing is a development. It's probably going to last, and probably we all have to get used to it, yeah. But it's still very complicated. So there's always a difference between where's the future going. Should you jump on the bandwagon right now? Should you implement this right now? I would say that it's a bit more nuanced than that, because we all need to work with the resources that we have. We all need to see what is actually important to us. We all need to decide whether we implement something like Google Tag Manager server side, and in 6 months we are going to do something completely different. So, and depending on money and how many people you have around yourself as well. So that's it. Okay, cool. It's really cool that everybody who was here has decided to join me. Again, this was a Measure Master live training. So if you saw this on Facebook, on YouTube, and you are interested in checking out Measure Masters, then head over to measureschool.com/measuremasters. And there we have all the information for you to sign up to Measure Masters. We have a waiting list now, and we have applications that we take. So take a look at what we have to offer there. Next month, we will have a live training with Simo Ahava, which I'm looking forward to as well, because he is much more into this server-side, GTM server-side world than me. And yeah, I'm looking forward to this as well. Thank you for everybody who joined us live today. I'm looking forward to the next one. And for now, my name is Julian. Till next time. Bye.